Hello, what's going on? It's me, Mr. Teddy from Teddy Kong Country, aka Majora T. But I'm here on my sub channel today to do a book review. I don't do these on the main channel. Tokyo Vice. Can I read this backwards? No, I'll read it forwards. An American reporter on the police beat in Japan. So this was a cool book. I haven't finished a book in a while, so it was nice to be able to read something that I really got into. I saw this book mentioned in one of my issues of Game Informer or Nintendo Force. I'm not sure which, but it had to do with the Yakuza series, so that leads me to believe it would be Game Informer since none of them are on a Nintendo platform. It was recommended because the reporter had some interviews and connections he had through the Yakuza and the police. And I think they made an HBO Max series out of this book. I believe it was published in the early 2000s, like around 2008, 2009. I could probably check real quick. But I like Japanese history. I think my understanding of Japanese culture is limited, like maybe to just like video games and stuff. So this was pretty cool. And I do like the Yakuza games. So I thought this would be like a natural fit. Yakuza culture. I like Yakuza movies. Maybe I could do a video on that sometime. But needless to say, I just went out and looked for a copy of this book online, and it was a couple bucks, and it was a good read. So it looks like this is copyright 2009, and then the first vintage books edition was 2010. But the HBO Max series is 2022. But anyways, I like this book, so I'm going to talk to you about what's going on in it, and hopefully we'll see if this is something you're interested in. Before we do, if you like this kind of content, be sure to subscribe. Every subscription helps motivate me to do more content. So, that's the thing. So is Tokyo. So this book starts off, I'd say the first half is really about Adelstein's process of becoming a gaijin reporter in Japan, and not one of many. He worked for a very powerful newspaper called the Yomiuri. I believe it's Shinbun is the word for newspaper. I could be mistaken. But it was a process of which he had to prove himself, and he had studied Japanese pretty proficiently. And to be honest, a lot of the beginning of the book, I don't remember it as much, maybe because of time, and maybe it's just not as significant as the latter half of the book, but it's still pretty interesting. There's a bit of expose of Japanese culture and society at the time, kind of like that Japanese social disconnect of the time, where people were becoming more enamored with online culture and not really talking with to each other, to the families and stuff. So I remember one segment he's talking about the top 10 seller books of the time in Japan, and three of them were had to do with your sex life. One of them was a suicide manual, and then the other three I don't remember, but pretty interesting looks into Japanese life at the time. Where the book really has its meat is in the stories, because he was an investigative journalist and he helped report on some of the things that are just the criminal activity and the criminal underground of Japan at the time. And there were some things I didn't understand. I didn't understand that, prior to reading this, that Japan was kind of a haven for human trafficking or illegal sex work. I didn't even understand that illegal sex work was as bad as it is. So it's a little hush-hush in Japan, and he reports on how, at the time, the prostitution laws were basically just don't have sex with the clients, direct vaginal penetration, and then it's okay, in a sense, and how a lot of places were, themed in this kind of, this sex world. And then even there was, an area of Japan called Roppongi where foreigners were working, foreign women, as sex workers. But he also distinguishes between the sex workers, hostesses, and that hostess culture where you take the person out for drinks and stuff, and It's more just about the idea of like having a partner or whatever. So there's pretty interesting spotlights there. Where it gets interesting is when it ties into the criminal stories. So there's a couple stories that stood out to me. One about a foreigner sex worker called Lucy Blackman who goes missing. And the police basically they don't really do anything about it because there's not a lot of laws protecting foreigners. And she's an example of the larger like scene of, or I don't know if scene's the right word, the larger conflict of foreigners being promised this like extravagant, high-paying lifestyle, and then they basically get stuck into doing sex work. And one of like the high-paying clients, basically, like, well, I don't want to spoil it, but like she goes missing, and then like it becomes a whole thing. And Jake Adelstein is one of the main reporters of this story, and he really goes the extra mile. And that turns into a later story about a whole scandal involving Yakuza and the sex trade. So that it was really interesting to read that. And then also he exposes sort of the loan sharking industry that the Yakuza had ties with as well as just the loan sharking industry as a whole, how there's this kind of like intimidation tactic, and it explains a lot about like Japanese suicide and depression and these tendencies to not talk about the problems because it becomes like a bigger problem. So, I think recently I've kind of understood that like Japan is not a perfect place, but I still like the culture. I like the ideas of like gamer culture and things like that. So like this isn't enough to turn me away from it, but exposes the darker side that I think people don't really talk about as much. I'd be interested to see how it's developed over the past 10 years, but I do appreciate him being a native English speaker working for the newspaper and bringing some of these stories to the American audience and American attention. Really good read. It's nonfiction, so this is his real life. And yeah, for a couple bucks, I mean, it's like 300 pages or so. So you could probably, it took me about 3 weeks getting into it. I don't know how long it takes you. I'm a pretty slow reader, but yeah, good read all around. Let me know, is there something you have read or would like to read, and any book recommendations for me? Thanks for watching, everybody. Peace.